Every single day, about 60,000 people in the United States alone are put under general anesthesia. 60,000. A doctor places a mask over their face or slides a needle into their arm, and within seconds, the person is gone. Not dead. Not sleeping. Gone. Their eyes close. Their muscles go slack. You can cut them open with a knife and they don't flinch, don't scream, don't remember. An hour later, 2 hours, 5 hours, the drugs wear off and they come back. They open their eyes. They're confused for a minute. Then they're themselves again. Whole, intact, as if nothing happened. We have been doing this for over 150 years. We do it with extraordinary reliability. The mortality rate from modern anesthesia in a healthy patient is something like 1 in 200,000. We are very, very good at putting people under and bringing them back. And we do not know how it works. I don't mean we're a little fuzzy on the details. I mean the fundamental mechanism, the actual answer to the question, why does this molecule make consciousness disappear, is not known. We know what the drugs do to certain receptors. We know which brain regions change their activity. We have correlations and models and working hypotheses. But we do not have an explanation. Not in the way we have an explanation for, say, how antibiotics kill bacteria, or how a vaccine trains the immune system, or how aspirin reduces inflammation. Those mechanisms are understood at the molecular level, cause and effect, step by step. Anesthesia is not. And that means something remarkable. It means we have been turning off human consciousness routinely, safely, millions of times a year without understanding what consciousness is or how exactly we're switching it off. That would be like successfully flying airplanes for 150 years without understanding aerodynamics. It works. Nobody argues that it works. But the why is a hole. A deep, strange, philosophically charged hole. Tonight I want to walk into that hole with you. I want to look at the clues. Because there are clues. Fascinating ones. And the more you follow them, the stranger the situation gets. Let me start with what most people assume, because it's wrong. And the wrongness is the first clue. Most people assume anesthesia is a kind of very deep sleep. The doctor gives you a drug that makes you sleep so heavily that you don't wake up when they cut you. Like a sleeping pill cranked up to maximum. Stronger dose, deeper sleep. That's the intuition, but that's not what happens. Anesthesia is not sleep. It's not a deeper version of sleep. It's not on the same spectrum as sleep. The brain under anesthesia looks fundamentally different from the brain during sleep, even the deepest stages. Let me show you why. During natural sleep, your brain cycles through stages. You've probably heard of REM sleep, rapid eye movement, the stage where you dream. And you've heard of deep sleep, sometimes called slow-wave sleep, where your brain produces these big, rolling, synchronized electrical waves. During a normal night, you cycle between these stages multiple times. Light sleep, deep sleep, REM, light sleep again, round and round. Here's the critical thing. During all of these stages, your brain is active, intensely active. During REM sleep, your brain is nearly as active as when you're awake. Neurons are firing all over the cortex. You're processing information. You're dreaming. You're constructing entire fictional realities inside your head. Even during deep slow-wave sleep, when the big slow oscillations are rolling across your cortex, there's a complex pattern of activity. Neurons fire together in bursts, then go quiet, then fire again. It's synchronized, but it's not silent. The brain is doing something organized, something purposeful, as far as we can tell. Now look at the brain under general anesthesia. The picture is completely different. Under a typical anesthetic like propofol, the most commonly used drug, the cortex becomes profoundly suppressed. The fast, complex, irregular activity of the waking brain is replaced by very slow, very high-amplitude oscillations. But these aren't the same as the slow waves of deep sleep. The pattern is different. Under propofol, you see a characteristic signature called burst suppression, brief flurries of activity alternating with periods of near total electrical silence. The EEG goes nearly flat, then bursts to life for a moment, then goes flat again. During the flat periods, large populations of neurons are simply not firing at all. That doesn't happen in sleep, not in any stage. Sleep suppresses certain kinds of activity and reorganizes others. Anesthesia, at surgical depth, squashes cortical activity to a degree that sleep never approaches. If natural sleep is the brain running a different program, anesthesia is closer to the brain being partially shut down. Not off, not dead, but suppressed in a way that's qualitatively different from anything that happens naturally. There's more. During sleep, you can be woken up. A loud sound, a shake, a bright light. Your arousal systems can be activated and pull you back to consciousness. The pathways are all intact. They're just not being engaged at the moment. Under anesthesia, those pathways are chemically blocked. A loud sound doesn't register. Pain doesn't register. The arousal systems aren't just idle. They're actively being suppressed by the drug. The off-ramp back to consciousness has been pharmacologically barricaded. And here's something that really separates the two. Dreams. During sleep, you dream. Your brain generates complex narrative experiences. Under most anesthetics, at surgical depth, you don't dream. You don't experience anything. When patients wake up from anesthesia, the overwhelming majority report a gap. Not a fuzzy, dreamlike gap. An absolute gap. One moment they were counting backwards from 10. The next moment they're in the recovery room. Nothing in between. No sense of time having passed. No dim awareness. Nothing. People who have been under anesthesia often describe it differently from sleep in a very telling way. After a night's sleep, you have some sense that time passed. Maybe you don't remember your dreams, but you feel like you were somewhere. After anesthesia, the experience is more like time was deleted. Not experienced and forgotten, but not experienced at all. That's a different thing. That's a profoundly different thing. And it tells us that whatever anesthesia is doing to the brain, it's doing something that sleep does not do. It's not just turning down the volume, it's changing the channel. Or rather, it's unplugging the television. So the first clue tells us what anesthesia isn't. It isn't sleep. Now let's look at the second clue, which is historical, and which is genuinely one of the strangest facts in the history of medicine. Anesthesia was discovered before anyone had the slightest idea how it might work, and the range of substances that can produce it is absurd. The first successful public demonstration of surgical anesthesia was on October 16, 1846. A dentist named William Morton administered diethyl ether to a patient at Massachusetts General Hospital, while a surgeon named John Collins Warren removed a tumor from the patient's neck. The patient didn't scream. He later said he felt no pain. Warren reportedly turned to the audience and said something close to, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." The era of painless surgery had begun. But ether wasn't the only game in town. Within a few years, chloroform was being used widely, especially in Britain. Then nitrous oxide, laughing gas, which had actually been noticed for its pain-relieving effects decades earlier by Humphrey Davy back in 1799, but nobody thought to use it for surgery. Then came a parade of other agents over the following century. Cyclopropane, halothane, enflurane, isoflurane, sevoflurane, desflurane. And alongside the inhaled agents, injectable ones, barbiturates like thiopental in the 1930s, then propofol starting in the 1980s. Here's what's strange. Look at these molecules. Diethyl ether is a simple organic molecule, 2 ethyl groups bonded to an oxygen. Chloroform is a single carbon with 3 chlorines and a hydrogen. Nitrous oxide is 2 nitrogens and an oxygen. Cyclopropane is a ring of 3 carbons. Halothane has fluorine, chlorine, and bromine hanging off a 2-carbon chain. Propofol is a phenol ring with two isopropyl groups. These molecules have almost nothing in common chemically. Different sizes, different shapes, different elements, different functional groups, different charges, different everything. And yet they all do the same thing: they make consciousness vanish. That's deeply suspicious. In pharmacology, when one specific molecule binds to one specific receptor and produces an effect, that's a lock and key mechanism. You understand it. The shape of the molecule matches the shape of the receptor site. But when a wildly diverse zoo of molecules, some no bigger than 3 atoms, some with complex ring structures, all produce the same basic effect, that tells you the mechanism is probably not a specific lock and key interaction. Something else is going on. Something more general. Something about a physical property that all these molecules share rather than a specific chemical structure. And that brings us to the third clue, the Meyer-Overton correlation. In the late 1800s, 2 scientists working independently, Charles Ernest Overton and Hans Horst Meyer, noticed something remarkable. They found that the potency of an anesthetic, how little of it you need to knock someone out, correlates almost perfectly with a single physical property, how easily the substance dissolves in olive oil. Olive oil. I'm not joking. They literally measured how well various anesthetics dissolved in oil versus water, calculated the oil-water partition coefficient, and plotted it against anesthetic potency. And they got a nearly perfect straight line. The more soluble a substance is in oil, the better it is at producing anesthesia. This held across an enormous range of compounds. Ether, chloroform, nitrous oxide, noble gases like xenon, even plain old nitrogen at high pressure, all fell on the same line. Why olive oil? Because olive oil is a lipid, a fat, and cell membranes are made of lipids. Every neuron in your brain is wrapped in a lipid bilayer, a double sheet of fat molecules that forms the barrier between inside and outside. The Meyer-Overton correlation suggested that anesthetics work not by binding to specific protein receptors, but by dissolving into the lipid membranes of neurons and somehow disrupting their function. That was a radical idea. Most drugs work by interacting with specific proteins. Anesthetics, according to this picture, work by soaking into the cell membrane itself, into the fat, which would explain why so many different molecules can do it. You don't need a specific shape to dissolve in fat. You just need to be fat-soluble. For about 100 years, this was the leading theory. The lipid hypothesis. Anesthetics dissolve into neuronal membranes, change their physical properties, maybe make them swell slightly, maybe change their fluidity, and this somehow interferes with the function of the ion channels and proteins embedded in those membranes. The membrane is like a pond, the proteins are like boats floating on it, and the anesthetic is like changing the viscosity of the water. Everything sitting in the membrane shifts a little, and that's enough to disrupt signaling. Elegant. Simple. Explains the diversity. Explains the Meyer-Overton line. But there are problems. Big problems. Starting in the 1980s and 90s, evidence began to accumulate that the lipid hypothesis couldn't be the whole story. First, researchers found exceptions to the Meyer-Overton correlation. Certain molecules that should be excellent anesthetics based on their oil solubility turned out to have no anesthetic effect at all. These were called non-immobilizers, fat-soluble, check. Should dissolve in membranes, check. Should produce anesthesia, according to the theory. But they didn't. The line wasn't as perfect as it first appeared. Second, people calculated how much the membrane would actually change when anesthetic molecules dissolved into it. The answer was not much. The expansion, the fluidity change, was tiny, on the order of what you'd get from raising the body temperature by 1 degree. And raising someone's temperature by 1 degree definitely doesn't make them unconscious. Third, and most damaging, researchers began identifying specific protein targets for certain anesthetics. Propofol, for instance, binds to a specific site on the GABA receptor. a protein that sits in neuronal membranes and controls the flow of chloride ions into the cell. When GABA A is activated, it lets chloride in, making the neuron less likely to fire. Propofol enhances this effect. It makes GABA A receptors stay open longer, flooding neurons with chloride, silencing them. Ketamine works differently. It blocks NMDA receptors, which are excitatory. Instead of turning up the brakes, it blocks the gas pedal. Different mechanism. Same result, reduced neural activity. Volatile anesthetics like isoflurane and sevoflurane seem to act on multiple targets simultaneously. GABA A receptors, glycine receptors, certain potassium channels, certain sodium channels. They're messy. They don't have one clean target. They're hitting multiple systems at once. So the picture shifted. From the 1990s onward, the protein hypothesis gained ground. Anesthetics don't just dissolve into membranes randomly. They interact with specific proteins, enhancing inhibitory channels, blocking excitatory ones, altering the electrical behavior of neurons through targeted molecular interactions. Case closed? Hardly. Because here's the problem. We now know some of the molecular targets. We know that propofol hits GABA. We know ketamine hits NMDA. Fine. But knowing which receptor a drug binds to is not the same as understanding why binding to that receptor makes consciousness disappear. Think about it. GABA receptors are everywhere in the brain. When propofol enhances them, it reduces the firing rate of neurons across wide swaths of the cortex and subcortical structures. Okay, but why does reducing neuronal firing rates abolish consciousness? You'd think it would just make you drowsy, sluggish, slow. Why does it produce a complete blackout of subjective experience? Why is there a threshold, a tipping point, where you go from groggy to gone? And here's an even sharper version of the question. Alcohol acts on GABA receptors too. So do benzodiazepines, like diazepam. So do barbiturates. They all enhance inhibitory neurotransmission. But they don't all produce the same state. Alcohol makes you drunk, disinhibited, emotional, clumsy, but conscious. Benzodiazepines make you calm and sedated, but usually conscious. Only at very high doses do these substances approach the annihilation of awareness that surgical anesthetics produce. What's different? Why does propofol erase consciousness so cleanly, while a benzodiazepine merely dims it? The answer has to involve not just which receptors are hit, but which circuits in the brain are disrupted, how the disruption propagates through networks, and what property of brain-wide neural dynamics corresponds to the presence or absence of consciousness. And this is where the trail runs cold. Because this is the hard problem. Not the hard problem of philosophy exactly, although it's related. I mean the hard problem of neuroscience. We don't have a satisfying theory of what consciousness is, physically, in terms of brain activity. We have correlates. We know that certain patterns of brain activity are associated with conscious experience, but we don't have a mechanism. We don't have a causal chain from neurons firing to the subjective experience of seeing red, hearing music, or feeling the warmth of sunlight. And anesthesia is the biggest clue we have. Because anesthesia turns consciousness off, cleanly, reversibly. If we understood exactly how anesthesia does that, we'd be very close to understanding what consciousness is, physically. The study of anesthesia and the study of consciousness are the same problem, approached from opposite directions. Let me tell you about some of the most intriguing current theories. None of them are proven, but they're pointing somewhere interesting. One line of thinking focuses on the thalamus. The thalamus is a structure deep in the center of the brain that acts as a relay station. Almost all sensory information passes through the thalamus on its way to the cortex. It's like a central switchboard. And many anesthetics strongly suppress thalamic activity. The idea is that by shutting down the thalamus, the anesthetic cuts the cortex off from its inputs. The cortex is still there. Its neurons might still be capable of firing, but they have nothing to respond to. No sensory information is reaching them. And without input, the cortex can't generate the complex dynamic patterns that somehow correspond to conscious experience. It's like cutting the power to a telephone exchange. The phones in all the offices still work, mechanically, but nobody can call anybody. The network goes dark. But this can't be the full answer either, because studies have shown that the cortex under anesthesia isn't just input deprived, it's internally disrupted. Even when you stimulate the cortex directly, bypassing the thalamus entirely, the response under anesthesia is different from the response in a waking brain. In an awake person, a magnetic pulse to one region of the cortex triggers a cascade of complex, differentiated activity spreading across multiple brain areas. Under anesthesia, the same pulse triggers a brief, local burst, then nothing. The activity doesn't propagate. It doesn't spread. It's as if the cortex has lost its ability to integrate information across regions. This observation has been picked up by a theory called integrated information theory, developed by a neuroscientist named Giulio Tononi. The theory proposes that consciousness is related to how much a system integrates information. A conscious brain is one where information is both highly differentiated, meaning there are many possible states, and highly integrated, meaning those states are connected to each other, influencing each other across the whole system. Under anesthesia, according to this framework, the brain loses integration. Individual regions might still be active, but they stop talking to each other effectively. The cortex breaks into islands. Local processing might continue, but the global integration that supposedly generates unified conscious experience falls apart. Tononi and his colleagues developed a measure called the Perturbational Complexity Index, essentially a number you can get by zapping the brain with a magnetic pulse and measuring how complex and widespread the resulting activity is. In waking consciousness, this index is high. In deep sleep, it drops. Under general anesthesia, it drops further. In brain-dead patients, it's near zero. The index tracks the presence and absence of consciousness better than any other measure we have. It's a clue, a strong clue. But it still doesn't explain why integration equals consciousness. It describes the correlation beautifully. The mechanism remains opaque. Another theory focuses on a phenomenon called neural oscillatory coherence. In the waking brain, neurons in different regions synchronize their firing at particular frequencies. Gamma oscillations, around 30 to 100 cycles per second, are thought to be especially important for binding together different features of a perception into a unified experience. When you see a red ball, neurons responding to red and neurons responding to round and neurons responding to ball-shaped object all synchronize in the gamma band, and this binding is thought to be part of what makes you experience a single unified percept, rather than a jumble of disconnected features. Under anesthesia, gamma coherence breaks down. The synchronization between distant brain regions collapses. Neurons may still fire, but they fire out of step, like an orchestra where every musician is playing from a different page. Again, a powerful clue. But what does it actually mean for synchronization to produce consciousness? Why should neurons firing in sync give rise to subjective experience while neurons firing out of sync do not? We don't know. We have a correlation, not an explanation. Let me add one more layer that makes this even more unsettling. There is a phenomenon called anesthesia awareness. In roughly 1 to 2 cases per 1,000 surgical procedures involving general anesthesia, the patient is not fully unconscious. They can hear things. Sometimes they can feel pain. Sometimes they're completely paralyzed by the neuromuscular blocking agents that are co-administered, unable to move or signal, but they're aware. Trapped inside their own body during surgery. This is, understandably, terrifying. Patients who experience anesthesia awareness often develop post-traumatic stress. It's a genuine medical concern, and anesthesiologists work hard to monitor for it, using EEG-based depth of anesthesia monitors and careful drug titration. But from a scientific standpoint, anesthesia awareness tells us something important. The boundary between consciousness and unconsciousness under anesthesia is not a clean, sharp line. It's fuzzy. There are intermediate states, states where some aspects of awareness persist while others are abolished. You can be conscious enough to hear, but not conscious enough to feel pain. Or conscious enough to feel pain, but not conscious enough to form memories of it. What does that mean? It means consciousness isn't one thing. It's multiple things, multiple processes, and anesthesia can disrupt some of them while leaving others partially intact. Awareness of sensory input, experience of pain, formation of memories, sense of self, motor control. These can be independently tweaked. This is actually consistent with what we know about the targets of different anesthetics. Propofol suppresses cortical activity broadly through GABA-A enhancement. Ketamine blocks NMDA receptors and produces a dissociative state where the patient is technically conscious in some sense, but disconnected from their body and environment. Opioids like fentanyl suppress pain pathways specifically. In modern surgical anesthesia, these drugs are often combined, each one targeting a different facet of the problem: hypnosis, analgesia, amnesia, and muscle relaxation. So the clinical practice has actually outrun the science. Anesthesiologists have figured out, empirically, through decades of practice, which combinations of drugs produce the conditions needed for surgery. They know that propofol alone might not be enough for pain control, so they add an opioid. They know the patient might still move reflexively, so they add a neuromuscular blocker. They know memory formation can persist after awareness is gone, so they watch the EEG for signs that the cortex is still processing. They've built an enormously sophisticated empirical framework. But ask them to draw you a diagram showing exactly how propofol transforms the neural dynamics of the brain from conscious to unconscious, step by step, cause and effect, the way a biochemist can draw the steps of how a virus replicates. And they can't. Nobody can. Let me step back and tell you why I think this problem is so important. Not just medically, not just scientifically, but fundamentally. We live in an age where we have split the atom, sequenced the human genome, detected gravitational waves from colliding black holes a billion light years away, and built machines that can beat the best human player at chess and at Go. Our mastery of the physical world is staggering, and yet we cannot explain why breathing in a particular vapor makes the lights go out inside a person's head. Consciousness is the biggest unsolved problem in science, not one of the biggest. The biggest. And anesthesia is our best experimental handle on it, because anesthesia lets us toggle consciousness on and off in a controlled setting. If there is an experiment that can crack the problem of consciousness, it probably involves anesthesia. The history of physics is full of cases where a practical technology preceded theoretical understanding by decades or even centuries. People built steam engines before they understood thermodynamics. People used magnetism for navigation before Maxwell wrote down the equations of electromagnetism. People bred animals and plants for thousands of years before Darwin and Mendel explained why it worked. Anesthesia might be the same kind of thing. A technology that works, that we use, that saves lives and prevents suffering, that we've refined and improved and made astonishingly safe, but whose fundamental mechanism points toward a piece of science that hasn't been finished yet. A piece that might be the most important piece of all. And there's a philosophical dimension here that I find absolutely electric. When we put someone under general anesthesia, what happens to them? Not to their body, to them. Where does the person go? In sleep. There's a sense in which you're still there. Your brain is still processing. You dream. You can be woken. There's continuity of some kind, even if it's dim and fragmented. Under anesthesia, the subjective report is, I wasn't there. Nothing happened. It wasn't like being in a dark room. It was like not existing. Now, of course, the person's brain was still there. Their neurons were still alive. Their body was maintained by the anesthesiologist. But the person, The experiencing subject, the one who sees and feels and knows, was gone, and then came back. Same memories as before, minus the gap. Same personality, same sense of self, but they were, for a while, switched off. What does that tell us about the self? About personal identity? About the relationship between the brain and the mind? It tells us, at minimum, that consciousness is a process, not a permanent state. It can be interrupted and resumed. You are not your brain in a simple static sense. You are something your brain does. And when it stops doing it, you stop being. And when it starts again, you start again. The same you? Probably, in any meaningful sense. But the continuity isn't guaranteed by the hardware, it's guaranteed by the process. Stop the process, and the person is absent. Start it, and they return. Some people find this frightening. I find it magnificent. Because it means consciousness is not magic. It's not supernatural. It's not an irreducible mystery forever beyond the reach of science. It's a physical process. A process that can be disrupted by a small molecule dissolving in the lipids and binding to the proteins of your neurons. It's natural. It's mechanical. And that means, in principle, it can be understood. We just haven't understood it yet. There's one more thing I want to leave you with, and it's the clue I find most provocative. Xenon, the noble gas, element 54. Xenon is one of the best general anesthetics known. It produces clean, rapid unconsciousness with minimal side effects and very fast recovery. Anesthesiologists would love to use it more widely, but it's expensive because it's rare in the atmosphere. Xenon is a single atom, a noble gas. It doesn't form chemical bonds under normal conditions. It has no functional groups, no charge, no hydrogen bond donors or acceptors. It's a perfectly spherical, perfectly inert, perfectly boring atom. And it erases consciousness. How? Xenon doesn't bind to receptors the way propofol does. Its mechanism seems to involve the NMDA receptor to some degree, like ketamine, but it also affects other channels. And its potency follows the Meyer-Overton correlation beautifully. It's very soluble in lipids. But think about what this means. A single, inert, sphereless atom, with no chemistry to speak of, can shut down the most complex phenomenon in the known universe, human conscious experience. There is something almost absurd about that, almost offensive. The most sophisticated thing we know of, the human mind, can be switched off by the most featureless object in chemistry. If that doesn't make you think there's something fundamental we're missing about the relationship between simple physical properties and the emergence of consciousness, I don't know what will. So here's where the investigation stands. We know anesthesia is not sleep. We know it involves suppression of cortical integration, disruption of thalamocortical communication, loss of neural coherence, and probably disruption of the brain's ability to sustain the kind of complex, differentiated, globally integrated information processing that correlates with consciousness. We know the molecular targets of many anesthetic agents. We know the Meyer-Overton correlation, imperfect but real, suggesting that lipid solubility still matters somehow. We know the clinical boundaries, the fuzzy line between awareness and unconsciousness, the independent components of the anesthetic state. What we don't know is the causal chain. We don't know how molecular events at synapses propagate through networks to produce a global state change that corresponds to the disappearance of subjective experience. We don't know why integration matters. We don't know what consciousness is, physically. And until we do, the explanation of anesthesia will remain, at its core, a mystery. A working mystery. A useful mystery. A mystery that saves lives every day. But a mystery all the same. 60,000 people will go under tomorrow. Every one of them will trust, correctly, that they'll come back. And not a single person on earth can fully explain what happens to them in between. I want you to sit with that. What bothers you more, that we don't know how anesthesia works, or that we use it anyway? And does the fact that we use it so successfully without understanding it make you more optimistic or less optimistic about the project of science? Think carefully. There's no easy answer.